Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, we saw Mal and the Beatles making the Help movie. Mal got a chance to play a part in it as a lost channel swimmer. Mal had a few problems with his brief scenes, almost being stung by a stingray, and then when they went to Austria, almost getting frostbite, waiting for his cue to pop out of the hole in the ice. So let's see what's going on today. In June 1965, the Beatles and their entourage traveled to Europe. They had their weed to keep them calm, courtesy of Mal and Neil. Mal was now a pot smoker himself. To make sure they had enough supply, Mal and Neil came up with a system where they bought 20 cartons of cigarettes at a time, removed the tobacco from each ciggy, and replaced it with pot. Brian Epstein was a little irritated when they were in Italy, and a promoter claimed that the band was losing its luster and was no longer able to sell out concert venues. Mal later wrote, after Brian had arranged everything many months before, the promoter had gone ahead and doubled the admission price, also booking the Beatles into halls that were twice as big as originally planned. Now the general population in Italy weren't able to afford the higher prices, so the halls were never completely packed, as we had come to expect on previous shows. The press was quick to pick up on this, for I guess bad news makes news from their point of view. For the Beatles, the highlight of their European visit was the Italians' wide-eyed wonder at the image of colossal Mal lugging their equipment from place to place. Mal said, "I've been called many things in my life, but it was on the Italian trip that people backstage call me Mammut. I kept thinking it was an Italian version of my name, until I found out it meant mammoth, the language barrier causing both hilarity and misunderstanding. Everyone I met seemed to be small stature, and I would see 3 of them struggling with a heavy piece of equipment, and strolling over, I would take it off them, hoist it up on my shoulders, and walk away with it, gaining my own little admiration society. They thought I was one of the strongest men in the world, and for quite a while after, I got called Mammoth instead of Mal by the Beatles." Just like all the other places the Beatles went to, the Italian authorities had difficulty controlling the crowds. In Genoa, the police were clueless when it came to dealing with Beatles-induced hysteria. Mal wrote in 16 magazine, "The show that night was crazy. The Italian police had never had to deal with anything like the Beatles before, and they just didn't have the first idea as to what to do. The fans went so wild that the police seemed to panic and kept turning off all the light stage ones, and the Beatles sang most of their last number, Long Tall Sally, in a complete blackout." When they reached Nice on June 30th, a different vibe had come over the Beatles' entourage. On one hand, there seemed to be a heightened sense of danger. Earlier in Lyon, fans had tossed a firecracker on stage, briefly throwing Mal and the group into a panic. On the other hand, the band members seemed to be more cavalier with their safety, daring to walk outside the bounds of their fame. Maybe because of the claustrophobia and sense of being isolated in hotel rooms, the boys began venturing out to see the sights. The Beatles' tendency for late-night merrymaking came to an end during the European tour, with the boys sometimes retiring for the night as early as 8 o'clock on their off days, ignoring their usual crowd of adoring female fans. Pot may have had something to do with it. Mal, on the other hand, still had his demon fully present. Mal said, "After the Nice show, Paul, for some reason, went straight to bed. Mal said, 'Yours truly stayed up entertaining all those beautiful young ladies, getting slightly drunk out of his head, going to bed around 7 in the morning.'" I guess he shouldn't have waited so long to go to bed, because the next morning, an hour later, Paul woke up Mal and persuaded him to take a driving tour that brought them to the gates of Princess Grace's palace in Monaco. They debated on whether to knock on the gate and ask for the former Hollywood star. After giving up the idea, Mal and Paul visited an aquarium in the south of France instead. As they wandered around the attraction, Mal noticed that the crowd of spectators were gathering and were more interested in Paul than the local sea life. That evening, the Beatles were invited to try their hand at go-karting in Nice. Mal wrote, "Alf, our chauffeur, and being a chauffeur, was determined not to be outdone by any of the Beatles, trying so hard to win that he crashed his go-kart and he broke his leg." The tour ended in Spain, and by July the 4th, almost as quickly as they had set off, the boys and their entourage returned to England. Mal was eager to see his family and drove the Comer van to Liverpool, with Ringo hitching a ride to see his wife Maureen back in their hometown. Driving up the M1, Mal and Ringo stopped at a roadside cafe for lunch. Mal recalled, "We were sitting at the counter, and the chap next to me obviously had been trying to make up his mind whether it was really Ringo with me. Suddenly he turned to me and said, 'I don't care if it's him or not.' And Ringo nearly choked with laughter as I teased the fellow, saying, 'No, it's not him, but it gets terribly embarrassing taking him anywhere because everybody mistakes him for Ringo.'" On July 29th, Mal and Lily attended the Help premiere at the London Pavilion. It was a star-studded affair, complete with a dinner celebration afterward. Lily recalled John asking her and Mal to join him at his table, reasoning that unlike the other Beatles, Lennon didn't have much family, save for Cynthia and Julian. Earlier that month, Ringo and Maureen purchased Sunny Heights, a lavish home in Weybridge, Surrey, not far from John's Kenwood estate. It was a great convenience for Mal, who often drove the Beatles back and forth among their residences. George by then was engaged to model Pattie Boyd, had lived at Kinfalls in Esher, also in Surrey, since the mid-1964. The day after the Help premiere, the Beatles gathered at the Seville Theatre, operated by the NIMS Enterprises, to begin rehearsing for their upcoming North American tour, a 16-day, 20-show sweep beginning at New York City's Shea Stadium and concluding with a return engagement at San Francisco's Cow Palace. Brian, working with General Artists Corporation, the tour promoter, had enacted several key changes to ensure the band's safety and their fans' enjoyment during the American jaunt. Epstein had the standard provision that the boys not be required to perform before a segregated audience. The group's writer specified a high-fidelity sound system in an effort to drown out the roar of Beatle fans, but it probably didn't work. He also requested a one-ton enclosed truck to be available at each venue to transport the boys between the venue and their hotel accommodation. It was also stated that there be not less than 150 uniform officers to be provided, along with a strong fence or barrier to prevent any of the audience from climbing over. On August 13th, the Beatles and their entourage landed at JFK in preparation for the Beatles' fourth and final appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. At the airport, the band felt anxiety when they were greeted by only a handful of kids instead of the thousands that we normally expected. Mal later discovered that the New York cops had done their job too well. With their walkie-talkies and good organization, they had succeeded in barring all the kids from the airport precincts, and only a few had managed to get past the barriers. The next day, the boys were scheduled to rehearse for their Sullivan Show appearance, which would be pre-recorded for broadcast on September 12th for the program's fall television premiere. For Mal, the trouble began after he brought the Beatles to the CBS Studio 50, to begin the 3-hour rehearsal. Larry Kane, the reporter, was there, and he later remembered seeing the roadie for the first time since the Bahamas, when he was in high spirits. Now Mal looked dour and almost depressed. Kane said his eyes squinted through his signature plain glass-framed glasses, and a cigarette dangled between the two shaking fingers. Concern was written all over his face as he trailed the Beatles into the compact dressing rooms. A few minutes later, Kane found out what was going on. He told him that John was sweating, shaking, looks like too many pills and stuff. As the rehearsal continued, so did Mal's sense of alarm, especially after John verbally attacked one of the show's technical staff. When the group filmed their performance, Kane took special note, wondering how Lennon would fare under the lights. Just before curtain time, John led the Beatles towards the stage, Kane wrote. Sweat was soaking through the top of his shirt. He glanced over, and suddenly his eyebrows arched upward, the visual sign that things were okay. Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall looked nervous, then somewhat relieved. They weren't out of the woods just yet. After the taping, Mal whispered to Kane, "Now we'll keep our fingers crossed for tomorrow night. To me, it's only another show, but it's really big for them." So the Beatles Shea Stadium concert, set for Sunday, August 15th, 1965, promised to be the largest event in rock and roll history. It had its sold-out audience of more than 55,000 people. On the eve of the record-breaking event, the Beatles had a blowout party at the Warwick Hotel, a happy, hippie, swinging affair, in Mal's words. By midnight, the gathering had proved to be a rollicking party by the Beatles standards, but it was shortly to be transformed into something even more. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards put the party into high gear. The two Stones weren't alone, having been joined by a couple of Supremes, the Tama Motown chicks that the Beatles really dig. The Beatles were taken with the Rolling Stone guitarist's coat, sports fit jacket that was straight lift from a rainbow. Immediately, the Beatles wanted one each. Bob Dylan was there, and he brought along an acetate of his new album. Del Shannon and the Ronettes were other guests at the party. Mal wrote, which went on well into the early hours. But despite the noise, the smoke, and the pretty girls, plus all the excited chatter, I was well whacked and fell asleep in an armchair in the corner of the room. Mal had predicted that the Beatles would be nervous that Sunday. Shea Stadium marked the biggest show of their careers. Mal wrote that the boys were unusually quiet. They get as highly strung and nervous as any other top performer. Once on the stage, making music, they are relaxed and confident. Beforehand, they tend to worry about how things will go, have doubts about the equipment sending out their correct sound, and that sort of thing. Setting up the gear was inescapably simple at Shea. To let the fans have a fighting chance of hearing the band that day, Mal had to place the microphones directly in front of the Vox amps and Ringo's drum kit, and turn up the guitar amps to maximum volume. In order to avoid the high squelching sound of the feedback, the mic'd speakers near the sides of the stage had to be turned to a lower level. Simply put, this meant that the Beatles could hear the guitars when standing in front of the amps, but very little, if any, of their own vocals. As Mal prepared for the show that day, it was clear that the band's souped-up 100-watt Vox amps would be no match for the massive crowd and their attendant noise. In order to gain a few extra decibels, the instrument's audio was wired into the stadium's public address system, little more than a series of small speakers hanging throughout the stadium on steel support girders. They had been designed, of course, to deliver announcements during sporting events, a far cry from the raucous amp music of a rock concert. To make sure the Beatles had a safe and timely arrival at Shea, the Beatles were transported by helicopter from Manhattan to the Port Authority heliport. From there, they traveled by Wells Fargo armed car into the packed stadium, where the 55,600-strong crowd was shaking the place to the rafters. Ed Sullivan made the introductions, exclaiming, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, honored by their country, decorated by their queen, loved here in America, here are the Beatles." So after the Beatles took the stage, Mal could only gaze around the stadium in wonder. The band's audience had finally crossed the Rubicon and managed to drown out every possible bit of sound, leaving nothing but the whirling tumult of white noise in their wake. Mal wrote, "I've never heard such an ear-splitting din as those kids kicked up when the Beatles made their entrances that night. The whole place went absolutely crazy. There could not have been one person in the audience who wasn't yelling at the top of his or her voice. It was just incredible." Overhead, a blimp floated into view with a neon sign blazing with the words, "Welcome, Beatles," and several hundred flash guns from the massive photographers packed around the stage and went off, making the scene like a Guy Fawkes fireworks night back home. In retrospect, it was clear the venue's PA system hadn't made a whit of difference. You couldn't hear what the boys were doing unless you happened to be sitting right next to one of the big amplifiers. That same weekend, a group of Indianapolis girls were holding a slumber party when they learned the Beatles were staying at the Warwick Hotel in New York City. "We were giggling and screaming listening to the radio," 16-year-old Georgiana Lewis recalled, "and one of the girls dared me to make a phone call to the Beatles Hotel. Though wary of accruing long-distance charges, Georgiana placed the call anyway. When the hotel operator answered, she said, 'Can I speak with Paul McCartney?' Amazingly, the operator put the call through, and Georgiana recalled the phone was answered by a British. I remember saying, 'Is this John?' And he said, 'What of it, love?' Then another voice came on the line. It was Mal Evans. The roadie was sorry that Paul was unavailable, but she said she was welcome to call back the next afternoon. 'Do you talk to anybody that comes through?' she asked. Mal replied, 'No, obviously not.' He later wrote that she seemed like a nice girl and he had enjoyed talking to her. The next day, Georgiana telephoned the Warwick as instructed, and Mal answered. When he learned that she had tickets to the Beatles' upcoming gig in Chicago, he suggested she stop by after the show and meet the band. We seldom ever get a chance to talk with a true American, Mal added. It's always celebrities. Georgiana and Mal were soon chatting like old friends. Well, I will end the video here. In this episode, we saw the Beatles go from concert to concert, and we saw that Mal and the Beatles were getting hooked on pot. We learned about promoters who were trying to pull one over on Brian and the Beatles. Then we saw how even the Beatles were nervous about the Shea Stadium concert, the largest concert they ever played in. It was interesting to see how Mal had to hook up amplifiers, and with all the tricks in the book, it's hard to hear the Beatles at all unless you were seated next to an amplifier. It must have been a nightmare for the Beatles and Mal. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. I want to wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.